Good evening and welcome. I'm Doug Fabrizio with the public radio station KUER. So a lot of us along the Wasatch Front are bracing for what is supposed to be the first big storm of this coming winter season. And it's been temperate, it's been dry for December so far, but a cold front is coming along with rain and snow, which means one thing for those of us fortunate enough to be able to get out of the weather. It means another thing entirely for those who cannot rely on shelter or find themselves without a warm bed for the night. So tonight, as the temperatures drop, if I have these numbers right, something like 300 people or so will not have access to a bed. The resource centers and shelters are at capacity in the Salt Lake City area. So it's in that context that we're having this conversation about homelessness tonight. We're going to talk about the nature of the problem. We'll discuss the forces at play, the economic forces, the social forces that contribute to all of this. We'll talk about who's responsible for these people. Is this a partisan issue, or does it actually say more about class than it does political orientation? Is this about housing and market forces that leave some people behind, or is it more a crisis of mental illness and addiction, or is it both of those things and more? And can you ever really solve a problem as enduring and baffling as this one? And also, do we have the political or the collective mutual will to fix all of this? Joining us this evening is Salt Lake City Mayor Erin Mendenhall. The mayor's been in the news the last few weeks and months as she's been rethinking her support for a new overflow emergency homeless shelter in the Ballpark neighborhood of the city. She's talked about wanting to find a better balance in distributing responsibility for homelessness. And we'll talk about that. And Mayor, welcome to you. Thanks very much for being with us.
Thanks for inviting me on tonight.
Wayne Niederhauser is with us. He was the president of the state Senate. During the last legislative session, lawmakers created a new office of homeless services. And in April, Governor Cox asked Wayne Niederhauser to serve as the new state homeless services coordinator. And Senator, welcome to you. Thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you very much, Doug. It's good to be here.
Jean Hill is also with us tonight. She's the chair of the Salt Lake Valley Coalition to End Homelessness. She's also director of the government relations for the Catholic Diocese of Salt Lake City. And Jean Hill, welcome to you.
Thank you, Doug. Pleasure to be here.
And we also have Sydney Brownstone with us. She's an investigative reporter for the Seattle Times. She's been part of a reporting initiative for the paper called Project Homeless. We asked her to join us through the conversation this evening to provide kind of a broader perspective, I guess, to talk about how Utah's issue might be different or the same as the problem in other places. She can talk about what has worked and what hasn't, as Seattle has struggled with all of this. And Sydney Brownstone, welcome to you. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
So I guess I want to begin with, it seems important that there might be some kind of agreement or consensus, just first of all, about the nature and the causes of homelessness. And I wonder, is there? Can we all come to some agreement on the nature of homelessness? And Mayor, I want to begin with you. Do you think that everyone agrees about there are all these complex forces, but do we all understand about the nature of homelessness, do you think? Do we agree about that?
Well, I believe that homelessness is as dynamic as each individual who may experience it at any point in time. And the dynamic forces on human existence are ever evolving in this world of rapid change, and particularly in a state like Utah that has the fastest population growth happening in the country and the strongest economy in many fronts. And yet we know that thriving economy and the opportunity of mobility doesn't reach everyone. And in fact, we can predict based on redlining and historic outcomes of some of our communities right here in the capital city, just where that kind of lack of access to the opportunity is and has been for a very long time. So I think it's a yes and conversation. It is evolving as our society evolves, and it is a very unique situation, but there are some very basic kernels, so to speak, that whether Jean's answering or Wayne or perhaps Sydney and service providers across the state, there's absolutely a housing crisis. There's affordability. There's the extreme divergence between housing costs and wages over time.
Yeah.
There's access to healthcare and inaccess, and there's a trauma. There's trauma that is a part of human experience to varying degrees from human to human. But in the conversations I have had, and that I think our service providers have, trauma is something to be recognized within these economic and other more sort of quantifiable issues that we face in trying to address homelessness.
Jean Hill, does that seem right to you?
It does. I think it's absolutely true. There are as many reasons that someone falls into homelessness as there are individuals who are experiencing homelessness. Bottom line is that people don't have the basic need of shelter. I mean, I think that is the nature of homelessness. You are lacking stable, secure shelter. And that includes people just, couch surfing at friends' homes. That still isn't housing. That is homelessness. And that is the bottom line, I think, for all of us, is trying to find people a safe place that is theirs to some extent. If you have the ability to stay there, you're not at the mercy of others. And that's what we're trying to get people to. And you're not in a position where you yourself just are not able to maintain your housing because you don't have the skills to do that.
Wayne Niederhauser, I want to hear you on that. The mayor says it's dynamic, it's complicated. She listed a number of these forces. I guess you agree with all of that.
It's very individual. There's no question, and I agree with those assessments. But I think we need to define it here first, so that we're talking on the same page. First of all, I believe that there are two situations that I have discovered. There are two homeless situations. One's acute, one's situational, and one is chronic. Situational homelessness, I think we need to define. That's a person who is living in housing, they have a job, and there's an event in their life like a health crisis. And then health bills come in, they can't pay their bills, they can't pay the rent, can't pay the house payment. There's a foreclosure, there's an eviction, and these individuals and sometimes families end up homeless if they don't have a safety net, a family or a community around them that can help them and keep them from ending up on the streets. Those individuals are fairly easy to get back into a housing situation. Then we have the chronic homeless situation. And this is not as much about affordable housing. It is because we need to get people into a stable housing situation, but it's more the core issues with chronic homelessness is mental health and behavioral health.
Does everyone agree with that? I'm guessing not everyone does. Cindy, let me start with you, though, at least to get to this question. So, and maybe you do all agree, I don't want to presume, but the idea of whether or not this is related to something larger and systemic, economic forces, or as Wayne Niederhauser said, individual. Sydney, I think you've talked about it as being something more systemic. Maybe talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So I've been a reporter covering homelessness in Seattle for going on 3 years now. And to everyone's points about everyone having a unique story, that's certainly true. But based on the literature and the research into homelessness and the reporting that I've done, homelessness is a structural problem, which means it demands structural solutions. And when I say structural problem, I mean that it's the result of the last 50 years of policymaking decisions at the local, state, and federal level. Mayor Mendenhall talked about the housing shortage. Those are policy decisions we've been making over the last 50 years. We can see in the people who are affected by homelessness, they're disproportionately non-white. And that's a direct result of the communities that have been deprived of land and generational wealth over centuries. When we talk about the difference between acute episodes of homelessness and chronic homelessness, situational homelessness turns into chronic homelessness, and homelessness itself is an exacerbating factor in terms of mental health crises and substance use disorders. So if you don't address homelessness at the outset, if you don't address the structural problems there, it turns into chronic homelessness, and then you've got a large chronically homeless population. The other reason why I think this is systemic is just reflected in national trends and national numbers. You know, we saw chronic homelessness, the estimates of chronic homelessness rise across the country by 15% over the last year. And it's been rising like that over the last decade. So, you know, this is not just a Salt Lake City problem. This is not just a West Coast problem. This is a national problem.
Mayor, what do you think about, and Mr. Niederhauser, I'll get you to spend some more time with this idea, but it sounds like what you're saying is that the core of the problem, yes, it's about housing, affordable housing, it's about market forces, all of those kinds of things, but you believe the core problem is mental illness or addiction. Mayor, what do you say to that? Do you agree that that is a major contributing factor? I mean, Senator Niederhauser says it's a core issue. Do you think that's right?
I do. I'm not a service provider, but from the folks that work at Salt Lake City and the organizations like Volunteers of America and the Road Home and others that we work with, including Catholic Community Services that Jean works with, that's not unique to Utah, not unique to Salt Lake City, but those numbers, around 70% to 80% of individuals experiencing chronic homelessness, also grappling with mental health needs that are either going completely unmet or being self-medicated. And I think that the broad brushstroke that I opened with, that homelessness is unique, is really that we should not make assumptions as housed people, as people who may not have the day-to-day work exposure that Wayne and Sydney and Jean do, about why someone's on the street. It's complicated. Mm-hmm. Life is complicated, but we are all living as Americans within these systems and structures, and the results of policies and the current effects of policies that Sydney talked about. So it isn't as though the solutions are outside of the realm of what we have control of. They are. But in many cases, whether it's mental health, and we're looking back to the Reagan era and the dramatic shift in the United States around access to mental health services, redlining that was made illegal in the 60s, but is still predicting outcomes for our residents here in Salt Lake City. There are generations of impacts that are literally built into the fabric of our society. And so it's not a switch we get to flip with one administration or one president, but it is absolutely structures. They are structures that are, I believe, within our grasp.
Jean Hill, does it matter? Does it matter whether or not this is the core problem is that this is about addiction or mental illness, or whether the core problem is that there are these market forces that's about housing and affordable housing? Does it matter? The fact is these people are unsheltered.
And that's exactly, and I think when we look at chronic homelessness, yes, it is mental health and substance abuse are a big piece of that. But for the homeless population in general, it's only actually about 25 to 30% who have both or one or the other of those conditions. So that's not the only factor that is playing on people. I think it really is. It is a systemic problem, and it's a systemic problem that also, it's not only the historical issues, it's ongoing policy. So for example, Utah's incredibly landlord friendly. It's very, very easy to evict someone. And, if you get 3 days notice, I don't know how many people listening in within 3 days could find money to pay their rent, find an attorney, and pack up all their stuff just in case in 3 days. So it's that lack of looking at this from the point of view, I think, of those who are experiencing homelessness. I think that's one of our bigger issues across homeless services and homeless policy. We come at this from the perspective of those of us who are housed. And really, we need to come out from the perspective of those who are experiencing homelessness, because they're the ones who know what they need. And for us to come in and say, here's what you need, and here's what we're going to give you, is not the most effective way to address the issue. So it does matter. We have to have access to mental health care and substance abuse. It shouldn't be that if you have a substance abuse problem, your best treatment option is going to prison where you can get free treatment. There's got to be that kind of access, but there's got to be access to a whole host of different services, especially for the chronic homeless who need that kind of wraparound support, not only to get housed, but then to successfully stay housed.
Senator, what do you think about all of this?
Well, Doug, I'm not an expert in homeless services or in any of this. I was put in this position because of my experience and ability to work with the legislature, because there are some systemic issues. There's no question in my mind about it. There are budget issues and there are policy issues that we're going to have to deal with. And that's why I was put in this position. But I've spent the last 7 months going across the state, visiting the local homeless councils. I spend, and this is, I'm not trying to toot a horn here. I'm just wanted to understand. So my wife and I spend a night every week on the streets with people that are experiencing chronic homelessness. I know their stories. I know them by name. I've asked them questions about what they want. Where would they like to live? And so my comments are at least a large part informed by what I've experienced talking with people that are experiencing chronic homelessness. And
what are they telling you they want?
Well, I'll bring this up now. I've asked, where would you like to live? What housing would you like to be in? They've been in housing multiple times. Only a few have, experienced a single episode of a housing situation. These individuals have been in and out of housing and it wasn't working for them because they have episodes, behavioral episodes. They have mental health episodes, and people end up back on the street. It's a community issue. I can't tell you how important community is to this group that we visit every week.
But Senator, what you seem to be saying there is that because they like camping, and I'm not being facetious, but because they like the part of the community, because some might be afflicted with mental illness, some may have addiction issues, even if you solved one of those core issues like housing affordability or the housing issue, that wouldn't solve it for some of these people. And you seem to be under the impression that that's a significant number of the homeless, that even if you solved that core question of those economic forces of housing, there would still be people who wouldn't be interested. Am I being fair?
Yeah, and this is what I've concluded just based on my experience. Is I go into our permanent supportive housing facilities here in the Salt Lake Valley, and they have to make ends meet, but they work with people on the financial side of it, and I don't see a lot that are necessarily being evicted from those facilities who are run by nonprofits, generally speaking. Just being evicted. Based on, like a private apartment owner. So what we have here is if you were easy to house, you'd probably be in housing today. What we have living on the streets are the hardest people to house. And about 20% of those have said, I like camping and I want to camp wherever I want to camp. That's what they've told me.
Okay, let's get a response to that. Gene Hill, what is that a fair or accurate impression? It's anecdotal, but you know, he
It's an
he's been
actual
traveling the
experience.
States. Okay, so yeah, so Gene Hill, what do you make of that? And Sydney, I want to hear you on this as well, all of you actually. So
I think it is the reality for some folks. I think though that we have to recognize that we have to have a system that addresses those crises that people are having. So yes, I like camping. I want to stay here. There's more to it, to that story, right? And we need to kind of dig a little deeper down into that story, because in order to reduce the number of people who are falling into homelessness, we've got to figure out where we're failing and why they're saying things like that. Why is it you don't want to be housed? Why is it you want to stay camping? What's happening in our system that we need to improve? One of those is finding affordable and decent housing. One of those is finding mental health care. We can't just focus on the crisis. We have to address all of the pieces that impact somebody's experience of falling into homelessness, all of the reasons they get there, and all of those barriers that keep them from getting out of homelessness. So our numbers of chronically homeless in Utah are relatively low. I mean, this is a population we can work with. So someone who says, I want to camp, let's get to know those people on an individual level so we can really figure out what's going on here, because there's more to the story than I want to camp. And I think it's incredible that Wayne is out there with learning from folks on a daily basis, because I don't think that happens on a regular basis for most of us. We don't have that sense that we need to go out and talk to homeless people. People don't even look them in the eye. I mean, I think homelessness is the experience of being invisible. So first, being visible is step one. And then let's get beyond that. I mean, we're working with a national program, we're just starting right now, that really is not only knowing who people are by name, but getting to really know their individual needs. And I think that's, Wayne is starting with the getting to know people by name. And then let's get into those individual needs and what is happening here that we really need to work with you, and where have we failed you, so that we can make it so that camping isn't the best choice that you can see in your future, because there's a lot more happening for you, that you understand that, what housing is something I deserve, something I need, and something that will help me live a better life and a life of dignity.
Sydney, you said something to us about the fact that when you see people as just being mentally ill or having substance abuse, that it becomes more intangible, that it makes it very disconnected from your own life. What are the problems of seeing it just as mental illness or an addiction crisis, beyond it being something more systemic and related to these larger economic forces, do you think?
Well, I think, keys to resolving the crisis of visible mental illness on our streets and visible addiction is housing. You can spend a lot of money trying to repair broken mental health systems or broken substance use disorder treatment systems. But if people get out of those treatment facilities or get out of those state psychiatric hospitals and have nowhere to go, they're going to decompensate again. So that's one thing. We know that the vacancy rate for rental units in Utah is extremely low. I guarantee you that for rental units at 0 to 30% of area median income, that vacancy rate is even lower. And the story in Seattle is that there used to be a time when people struggling with mental illness and substance use disorder could crowd into what we called single room occupancy units, SROs. And SROs have a really bad reputation, and they weren't nice places to be, but they functioned as a kind of last housing. And over time, as the city has gentrified and it's become a tech hub, that type of housing has disappeared. So that whole section of the market, 0 to 30% AMI, is basically gone, which means that the type of people who once could live in a place on disability, say for $775 a month, that housing just doesn't exist. And so I think it's important to point out that, people can be housed and have mental illness, people can be housed and have substance use disorder, but we've basically regulated, and market forces have contributed to wiping out that bottom end of the market.
Mayor, what do you think about this question of the market forces? I kind of want to shift it to sort of understanding it in that way. One of the things that Cindy's written about is what's happening here in Utah right now is what happened in Seattle. It's what I think happened in San Francisco. People with, larger incomes flooding into cities, but those cities weren't building enough affordable housing like single room occupancy, to make up for the people who were being displaced. So rooms available for people of lower economic means were being, replaced by much more expensive housing. And the market was completely leaving these people out. How much of that is a function of what you see happening in Salt Lake City and elsewhere?
Well, we had over 800 single room occupancy units in Salt Lake City in the early 80s, late 70s. And many of those buildings no longer even exist anymore. They're where all the downtown rising that happened in our downtown core and parking lots of today are. We have exactly 50 single room occupancy units. They're all at one location downtown, and they're actually run quite well. And from a community impact perspective, they're a great operation there. But we have on the city council docket that's been sitting there since early in my time as the mayor, a request to the council to expand the zoning so that we can start recreating single room occupancy. And there's partners at the state in terms of funding through the Olin Walker Trust Fund. There's partners in the city through the millions of dollars we crank into affordable housing every year. We just put 8.2 back out on the market in October, asking for permanent supportive housing up through other affordable housing levels. And we need it, but the city council hasn't voted on it. So there are a lot of things at play. Sydney's right on that the housing was there. And in Salt Lake City, what it is now and what it's become as those 800 units dwindled down is the hotels, really the motels along the State Street corridor, North Temple corridor. And instead of them being, potentially run with case management and wraparound services, they're run for profit by people who may not be looking out for the best needs. I've met sex workers on State Street who paid more over the course of a single month than I was paying in my mortgage at the time because of this 24-hour cycle and the expense of one night in one of these motels. It's not affordable housing by any means. Actually, they're paying a lot, but it's a 24-hour cycle. And it was something, that they're trapped in financially and in other ways as well.
Wayne Niederhauser, what do you think about this part, that the idea that there are these market forces at play where there used to be a lot of these single room occupancy opportunities, whereas now there aren't very many now because they're displaced because, look at the housing market, expensive, apartment buildings and those kinds of things. How are you thinking about the market forces? What are you thinking? And your fellow lawmakers, the people at the state, how are they thinking about that component of all of this?
Well, Doug, I think that market forces have always been, have played into this, even in the days of SROs. But land in Salt Lake Valley, anywhere along the Wasatch Front, has become very prime.
Yeah.
And if there's a way to make more money off that land, yeah, there's economic forces, especially now, where we would tear down, a more affordable housing building and put in a new building. And the fact that it's new and maybe a little bit more modern, there's a profit incentive there. We want to, or meeting, some demand by the general public. And so I think some of that has happened. But I just have to say that, and again, this is just my experience. I'm not an expert in this, but in my discussions with people, and my wife and I have kind of concluded that sometimes I think we're trying to hammer a square peg in a round hole. And maybe the solution is just to make a square hole. And those are some of the things, I'm starting to think about, is there are people out there now that are selling their homes. I don't understand this. It's probably something I wouldn't do. And buying a van and living the van life. And there are people in our society that I think from probably the beginning of time that have wanted to not be tied down to things. And I'm not saying this is the be all, do all, end all. I'm just saying there's, I think, a certain percentage of the people that don't want to have those responsibilities, and it's kind of a nomadic life a little bit. and so I think we have to start thinking in those terms a little bit, because like it's been very well articulated here already this evening, we come at this from our perspective, and we don't appreciate where this person has been, the trauma where these persons have been, the trauma they've experienced. We're talking people that have been in intergenerational poverty and they don't know anything different. Why would I want to be there? Why would I want to do that?
But
I've
Senator,
never known it.
Doesn't that let you and others off the hook for dealing with the unfairness of these market forces? What you're saying is that they're nomads, and there are people who want to make money off these houses. They should be able to do that. I guess, that is one of the questions is, do we have the political will to solve something that is so bound up in these economic forces? So I want to hear from the well, you respond to that first of all. It seems
Yeah,
like
let me respond. I'm not saying everybody's got the nomad feeling. Okay.
No, sure.
I mean, this would be a certain, just based on talking with people. Okay. They don't want those kind of responsibilities, and that shouldn't be an excuse in any way. I'm just saying that we are looking at this from our point of view. We need to probably, if we're going to have more success, look at it from their point of view, and what will work for them. And because the Constitution allows them to choose. And there's only one way I can force somebody, or a couple of ways, I guess, into a situation of treatment or for mental or behavioral health, is if you're a risk to yourself or others, you can be forced into a mental health treatment situation, but that's a really high bar. Or, they get involved in the criminal justice system, and that's not the solution. But that's how a lot of people have gotten treatment and have actually gotten out of their situation homeless, because they didn't want to go through that system again. And so I'm not saying criminal justice system is the solution, but I just feel like sometimes we're trying to get this square peg in that round hole, and I think we just need to change the shape of the hole sometimes.
Who wants to respond to that?
I do.
Mayor, please.
I want to go into the square peg a little bit more. That I'm plenty guilty of loving to look at somebody's van life hashtag on Instagram and wishing I could just drive off into the sunset and live in my camper van for a while. But what Salt Lake City is experiencing is really not looking like that. And we even have a KOA on North Temple, but they have a year restriction on the age of vehicles that can go park there, and it's newer RVs. What we end up having for the RV housed population is older RVs that are affordable to obtain, that end up in some cases unable to move once they've parked. We passed a budget amendment recently to get money into the hands of the owners of those vehicles so they can fix them, so they can keep them moving. And we have a 48-hour parking limitation in Salt Lake City. We end up with entire neighborhoods of RVs along stretches like 17th South in Salt Lake, sometimes along 5th South in Salt Lake City. And it's not the van life situation that people see on social media. That is not what this is. It's people who are homeless but for an RV situation, and they have specific needs, and folks with our service providers go out and try to engage that. But the reality of cities across this state, by and large, not tolerating someone parking an RV on the side of the road for 24 hours or 48 hours. And there is some attraction to being in these central city locations like Salt Lake City, like Ogden, even Logan and St. George, Provo to some extent. So what is it? If there's a really affordable RV spot in Farron, Utah, which there is in a trailer park there, why aren't people going there if that's the life that they want to live, just in their van? There's something about these central city locations. There's access to something. And whether or not that's the services that Jean's folks at CCS provide, I don't know. And maybe you could speak to that, but I wanted to add one more piece, which is to Jean's question, why are people choosing chronic homelessness? And changing that square, changing the whole to fit maybe more of people's needs. And that's what we're trying to do with the tiny home community. Because when I've asked people on a cold January night, when it is snowing, and we have a van here, if we can help you get your stuff in the van, there's a bed waiting for you at the shelter, will you come? No, because this is my community. And I've been in housing before and it doesn't work. And I've been anonymous and I've been alone, and I don't want that. And everybody gets that. Everybody wants to feel recognized and respected and valid. And we've seen success in tiny home communities across the country where people can have the independence of having their own space, but they live in a communal way. And so I think that's an example of how we're trying to make, that peg hole fit more of the needs of people.
Jean, what do you think about that? I want to come back to the market forces, the affordable housing question. But I want to give you both, and Sydney, I want to hear you on this as well. Jean, what do you think?
Well, I want to go to the market forces too, because I think we're talking about two different things. There's a difference between being forced into an option and having a choice. And I think what we're seeing, this is why government has to be involved in addressing homelessness, because the market is not going to provide for people who are making minimum wage. If you make minimum wage full-time in Utah right now, anywhere in the state, you can afford $377 in rent. That's it. There isn't a place.
Good luck, right?
Yeah, right? Anywhere. I mean, that is in our smallest, most rural counties. You cannot get a place for you for $377. If you're willing to take on 4 roommates, great. But if you have a family, that may not be the best option for you either. So supply and demand is pushing people out. A person with a disabling condition can afford $725 a month. Again, good luck there as well. So government has to be involved in these solutions. And what we do know is, not everyone who we work with on the street says, yeah, I want a McMansion in Sandy. We're not, looking for one size fits all solutions for people. And I think this is somewhat what both Wayne and Erin are talking about. We don't need the same housing solution for everybody, but that you're homeless doesn't necessarily mean that anything will work for you either. So we need to put people in the right housing for their needs to meet what they need. For some people, an SRO is exactly what they want, and they're more than happy to move into an SRO. For some people, that's not quite what they need either. For some people, a tiny home is great. For other people, a tiny home is going to be a horrible experience for them. So we need to be addressing the needs that are out there. And again, the only way to do that, because market forces do not favor the poor, is to have government involved to make sure that that kind of housing is available.
And by that, you mean offer subsidies.
You have to have subsidies.
Tweak them a little bit.
Yeah, developers will tell you that, permanent supportive housing doesn't pencil out for them. There's no profit in permanent supportive housing. Yep. So as a government, we have to prioritize people over profit and say, great, it doesn't pencil out, but we are going to make sure that we have adequate housing for people to be secure and safe and have basic needs met.
Cindy, what are you hearing so far in this conversation? How is it? Is it tracking what you hear in Seattle?
Yeah, it's actually remarkable the extent to which the exact same conversations are happening in Seattle, and probably every West Coast city. This is happening in LA. This is happening in San Francisco. The conversation about individual factors versus systemic ones, the role of government, affordable housing, et cetera. It's, verbatim the exact same thing that's happening in Seattle. One thing that I think would be helpful though is to be clear about definitions. So the federal government's definition of chronic homelessness isn't just I've been homeless consistently over 3 years, or I've been homeless X number of times in the last 10 years. It means that you've been consistently homeless, or you've experienced homelessness, I think, I don't know, 3 or more or 8 or more times, I forget the exact number, and you have a disabling condition. So it's not just, I'm outside and I live in a tent and I'm here for an extended period of time. It means that I also have PTSD, or I have a physical disability, or I have severe mental illness. And so, these aren't necessarily people who are going to pick themselves up by their bootstraps and join the workforce and make money and rent an apartment on their own. There's no way that they can rent an apartment on their own, given the units available. The other thing I think third, and is important to clarify, is choosing chronic homelessness. It's important to look at the universe of choices someone has when they're in that position. And so if you're living in a tent, so you're chronically homeless, which means you've been homeless for a long time and you have a disabling condition, the options that you have right away are maybe to go into a shelter. Up until the pandemic, the vast majority of shelter options were congregate shelters. In Seattle, that meant mats on the floor, sometimes 6 inches apart. And because of those disabling conditions, whether it be PTSD or a physical condition or something like that, those shelters weren't necessarily appropriate places to be. Sometimes people really would rather choose to be outside with all of their belongings than have to give up those belongings, or a dog, or a partner, in order to be in a shelter where all their stuff would get stolen for the night. And so I think, when we look at those choices, we also have to consider the fact that shelter is not housing. If government is not creating funded pathways out of shelter into housing, we're not really solving homelessness. We're just kind of shuffling things around on the board. So yeah, that's my 2 cents.
Yeah. I want to, let's come back to this in a minute, because I want to talk a little bit about what it means for the government to get involved. Subsidies, how much would this cost? What's the political will to, I'm seeing numbers upwards of $500 million that it would take to really deal with some of these housing numbers. We can get to that in a moment, but let me sort of shift gears here for a moment. Mayor Mendenhall, earlier this month, you banned new homeless shelters for the next 6 months. The idea, of course, was to stop this effort to create this overflow emergency shelter in the city's Ballpark neighborhood. Talk about why you did that. You say this is an issue of balance, and I want to get to that point.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought it up, because at the beginning in the intro, you mentioned a change of heart on the position of a future permanent overflow shelter, which isn't accurate actually, because the way it was presented to the new Utah Homeless Council, which Gene sits on and Wayne and his staff lead, and many other stakeholders participate in, was that this would be an acquisition for a potential future winter. And the reality that we didn't discuss at the time was that this, through the allowable zoning in it, could become a permanent year-round shelter. And that is not what that wasn't the proposal. And I don't think that was the intent of the exchange that was taking place between the two organizations. But that is a big conversation for any community to have. And I will say I'm very grateful, and I am actually more optimistic than I've ever been as a Salt Laker and as an elected person in the city, because of the creation of Wayne Niederhauser's role and the way he is stepping into that role, and the conversations that he is enabling and creating through that role about responsibility, and the fact that this is a statewide humanitarian crisis. And there are some big money conversations that need to be had about that. So Salt Lake City is 17% of this county's population. 17% of Salt Lake County. That's all Salt Lake City is. Actually, last year we were 18%. It's a decreasing number for us.
So you're making a point.
We are 74% of the permanent supportive beds. We are the majority of services. And we are with the Ramada Inn that the coalition is getting up and running, going to have over 1,000 shelter beds this winter compared to about 1,600 countywide. So we are shouldering a great deal of services in this city with $0 guaranteed from the state of Utah.
So the reason you made that decision was to make that point. You're basically saying, look, enough is enough. We need to draw the line somewhere, and I'm drawing it here.
We do, and we need to have a process through the Utah Homeless Council. If that's the way that shelters and future shelters could potentially receive the validation to get funding from the state, there needs to be a public discourse mechanism built into that. Because if a private landowner gets approached by the Coalition to End Homelessness or a service provider, and they can do a private land transaction, that is a real estate right that they have. And if they want to go to the state to say, help us fund this, and that is the only time that the public could potentially be involved in the creation of a place like that, we need a better mechanism to have a community conversation about it. So we needed to make sure that there weren't going to be more applications for permanent shelters to pop up in Salt Lake City before we figured out how to make sure a public discourse can happen.
Jean Hill, do you think that's right? Do you think the city is shouldering too much of the burden, that's not really fair? And just how, I get that as a point of principle, but just how does that work in real terms if you have people who don't want to be bused somewhere else? They want to, Mayor, you actually kind of made the point yourself. They want to be in the city. So
well, I've got to interject there because It's not bust out of the city. People are, every city's going to tell you, oh, they're busing people into our city. But I have had mayors and council people from across the state of Utah look me in the eye and tell me, if we see somebody experiencing homelessness in our city, we put them in the back of the cop car and take them to Salt Lake because that's where the services are. This is happening. It's happening in Ogden. It's happening in Logan. It's happening in Cedar City, to some extent, St. George. And for us in Salt Lake County, Midvale and South Salt Lake are guaranteed support dollars from the state of Utah every single year to deal with the community impacts from hosting a shelter. Salt Lake City is guaranteed $0, zero. And that's something that we're hoping to take on in the next legislative session.
Jean Hill, what do you think?
And I'm going to tell you, I think any public process you have is not going to say, please bring the homeless to us. No matter where you try and put people who have no housing, people are going to object. And I think that's the hardest part about this. There's no question Salt Lake City has the bulk of the services and the bulk of the people. But I think we're having these conversations on the backs of people who have nothing. And we're trying to make people who have at least a home feel better about it, or a business feel better about it, which again, that's reality. But the bottom line is we have to find a solution. And I think we have to recognize that the city does have all these services. And we're talking about people who aren't extremely mobile. They can't just hop in their car and go somewhere else for services for the most part. Some can, but that's pretty rare. So we need to own where the services are, I think. And I do think other cities need to step up, but I don't think that having other cities step up means we outsource the homeless to other cities. I think other cities stepping up means that they're contributing towards the burdens that Salt Lake City is addressing. Have them pay in like we have done with the Mitigation Fund, but let's raise what's paid in. If you don't have homeless services, help us provide the services where people are at. Let's meet people where they are, because these people don't have choices of where they go. So I do think the city has to sort of own that that's where people are going to be. And then we can get those other cities to, maybe they can contribute more housing. Maybe they can do something about policy so that people who are riding the tracks line aren't treated differently depending on where they get off of tracks, right? Let's get some consistent treatment of people who are homeless. And let's just recognize as a state, wherever a homeless person is, that's where they're a resident, because that's their only option, is where they're at right at that moment. And I'm really concerned that we're always sort of pitting residents against the homeless, because I think we have to recognize that homeless people are residents too, and they don't have a voice and they aren't heard. So when we have whatever process we have, somehow that voice has to be the one that gets the priority treatment, because those are the folks who don't have any options and are forced to do whatever it is we tell them and go wherever it is we tell them they can go. Otherwise, or they're on the street and they're camping illegally.
Mary, you want to respond?
Well, I feel a little bit like, Jean's, like you're saying that the city needs to own that this is the city's problem. And I hope that's not what you're saying, because that would be really ignoring the fact that affordable housing has been disallowed in a lot of cities in this state for a long time, until the state legislature stepped in a couple of sessions ago and required that cities come up with affordable housing plans. There are actually zero teeth for any of those cities to do anything around implementing those affordable housing plans, making the affordable housing possible. So if you end up running a city that doesn't put a priority or a single dollar on the creation of affordable housing for your people, but does the market path that Wayne described earlier, where, yeah, if we can tear this old apartment down that may be naturally occurring affordable, because we're going to build a nicer apartment and it's going to, garner market rates for us, that's going to happen. We have those cities all over the state of Utah. But the reality of the economy and the systems that Sydney's talked about is that there are people of earnings, even minimum wage in this state, that can never afford that. So to say, like, the capital city in any state who probably has more homeless people, people unhoused, living on the streets as residents there, need to just accept the fact that that's what they get, is myopic. And it is not actually going to help us address the future of potentially housed Utahns or unhoused Utahns when we are not creating access to truly affordable and dynamic types of housing. And I mean that from, as we've talked about, SROs, it could be tiny homes, it could be family-sized units, but we've got to get real about the fact that this is a statewide issue.
So Wayne Niederhauser, what do you say to that? How do you mediate this? You're thinking about the state. Resolve that issue.
Yeah, thank you. The expectations are high.
Yes.
Well, I mean, we could talk about this for a long time. I'm very sympathetic to what the mayor says. There's a thing called mitigation funds. And I don't want to get into all the details of that, but when we did Operation Rio Grande, when I was Senate president, we gave certain cities who have shelters money, guaranteed money, as the mayor said, and somehow the Salt Lake was left out of that. And
what do you mean somehow? How do you explain?
Just, through the legislative process.
Mayor, how do you explain that?
I really don't.
Because I wasn't the mayor, but I'll tell you, it's the typical politics of Salt Lake City and the state legislature.
I was going to sort of go there. Go ahead, Wayne.
There may be some partisan issues there. I didn't remember there being that kind of issue. Mainly the South Salt Lake and Mid-Belt people came in. We were forcing shelters on them. Mid-Belt had experienced a shelter temporarily. And so there was some sympathy there. Salt Lake, I think, had, been taking that burden for a long time. So they were guaranteed some mitigation funds, and this is public safety. So these are for the police departments to mitigate the impacts of having a shelter in their community. So here's what we're doing to try and solve that. I recognize that that's a big problem, and that Salt Lake and some other cities have been left out of that. Ogden being one of them, St. George another. And so I've gone to work to try and get, my office has gone to work to try and get more mitigation funds. And those mitigation funds today, currently, actually are paid by other cities who don't have shelters. And I actually think that's a really good model, so that everybody's paying into this, even if you don't want to have a shelter in your community. But we've got $5 million in the governor's budget to double the size, almost double the size of the mitigation fund. And I believe that if we can get the legislature now to agree to that, it'll be hopefully a different story for Salt Lake City, for St. George, and for Ogden. And that's mitigation. That's that mitigation issue that the mayor's talking about. But yeah, I also have to say that in this discussion is it's going to be really hard for us to duplicate services across the state. And I'm just thinking through this, so we're not landing on this is the way it is. And I'm just speaking in generalities. Is what is the problem here? It's the problem with this is this interaction conflict between those who live like us in a what we call a healthy lifestyle or middle class lifestyle, and those who are chronically homeless. And there's a conflict when those two populations meet. And that's why we can't get a city without forcing them to take a shelter. The legislature had to force South Salt Lake to take the men's shelter. And because nobody wants to have people who are chronically homeless wandering in their community.
Let's talk about that.
There's a lot to be said about this part, and I'm wondering, how do we reduce this conflict?
Well,
I'm just going to say, I've got some ideas about that, and one of those is case managed housing, and I'll leave it at that.
Okay, well, maybe this gets us too off track of that, but it did. One of the listeners tonight, Tony, wrote to ask the question of how you were going to deal with the NIMBY issues that always come up along this, that, as Tony mentions, are prevalent almost everywhere, especially in the communities along the bench and in Sugar House. Sydney, this is one of the things that you found, that you talked about how this is not, in a lot of these places, a partisan issue, that it's not about political affiliations. It's a class issue. It's people of affluence who don't want shelters or affordable housing or mother-in-law apartments in their neighborhoods. And they say their property taxes are going to go down, that there will be syringes on sidewalks, there will be lots of crime. So they're just not having it. How much of that is a part of this part of the conversation, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just important to recognize, Seattle, for example, is a deep blue city. I don't know what the numbers were in terms of voting for, President Biden over former President Trump, but, we're almost like a caricature of Democratic voters. But at the same time, homelessness is an incredibly divisive issue, and it's incredibly emotional, and the tenor of debates is exactly like the one we're talking about tonight. And yeah, people don't want to see visible homelessness, but oftentimes they don't want to see multi-family housing. So that's a contradiction of terms too. If you don't want to see visible homelessness, that means that housing has to be a part of the solution. But the way that a lot of cities are zoned necessarily excludes that housing. And also, even zoning changes don't guarantee affordable housing and supportive services. So yeah, I mean, I think what we've seen in Seattle is every time there's a plan to increase housing or put a shelter somewhere, there's always going to be consternation over the siting of those places. But we also need to have a real conversation about evidence-based solutions, which is housing. I've been reading researchers who have been writing lately that homelessness is a lot about, talking about homelessness is like a lot about, is similar to talking about climate change, in that, it can be very polarizing. And people want to sometimes drill down into individual behaviors, like what can I do to decrease my carbon footprint? But the actual solutions happen on a much larger scale than that, and are made at the policy level and by governments. But the way that I think about it too is, when we start seeing wildfires across the West, and in the future, no one likes a wildfire in their backyard, but how many people are connecting that to emissions? It can be kind of an abstract thing to do. And I think that's the tough part about homelessness. You don't like seeing visible homelessness. No one likes seeing visible homelessness. At any level of income, it's disturbing. It's sad. It's all of the things. But how do we connect that, and how do we translate that that dislike of seeing people in distress to actual solutions, which means density of housing, which means, maybe a view gets blocked here and there. So I think that's the challenge for policymakers.
Jean Hill, I want to hear you on this issue. And there's a lot there. I know it's the question of whether or not that Nimby issue is one. The other kind of resistance, but what are you thinking so far, at least about this part of the conversation that you're hearing?
Housing is the solution. And I think we absolutely, I did say, I think Mayor Mendenhall may not have heard me, but I did say one of the things other cities can do is open up affordable housing, because that is ultimately the solution until we can get a housing stock for folks who are homeless. And, the beauty of Utah is our homeless population is a manageable size. That is one advantage we have over Seattle and LA and others. We don't have the tens of thousands of homeless. We can actually manage the population we have. And if we are able to get, especially our chronically homeless, if we can get those folks stably housed, we don't need as many shelter beds. So that housing piece is the critical first part. And again, we've had this sort of a debate in the state about what housing first is, and it's been misdefined sometimes for purposes that are a little bit nefarious, but it's definitely housing first works. It is the evidence-based success story. And it works for us. We have a 96% success rate when we give people permanent supportive housing. Not everyone needs that kind of housing. It's the most expensive kind of housing, but that provides all those wraparound supports that people need if they're going to be successful at staying housed. And it does need to be statewide. It can't just be building affordable housing in one section of a city. It's got to be affordable housing statewide. And I do think that that is a priority decision that the legislature can make. And thankfully, this coming session, they'll have a chance to make that decision, because they have an opportunity to put 200 million into deeply affordable housing, or at least 100 million into deeply affordable housing. So if we're serious about addressing homelessness, and we really do want to get people off the street, then we will make that kind of an investment into deeply affordable and permanent supportive housing.
Wayne Niederhauser, is the state serious about it? Are they willing to spend $100 million, $200 million?
We're going to see.
What do you think?
Our office worked really hard and got $128 million in the governor's budget. It'll now be our job probably more specifically, to get that passed through the legislature for deeply affordable housing. And I think we really need to understand that when we're dealing with people who are experiencing chronic homelessness, we're talking about the lowest of affordable housing. With tax credits and some other things and a little bit of subsidy, we can build 60% AMI housing, but that's not for the chronic homeless. Those are more for situational homeless. They just need a little bit of a subsidy, and this person or this family can stay housed. But when we're talking about chronic homeless, this is the most difficult. It's the most misunderstood by the general population. We don't understand. And so they become somewhat invisible. We don't want to see that situation. We don't want them in our neighborhood, because usually drug and criminal activity follow this population, mainly because of substance abuse. And so we're going to get 128 million, I'm hoping, through the legislature now to hopefully leverage with other funds, philanthropic and cities and counties, so that we can hopefully double it or triple it to get more of this deeply affordable housing. But it's not just housing, as I think Jean has articulated here, is you have to have the supportive services. And I think the reason why a lot of the people that I know who live on the street are not in housing is we never really gave them those supportive services that they needed. And I think this happens too much, is that we take somebody off the street and put them in housing, but for a lot of reasons, they end up back out. And like I said before, some have been in housing like a half a dozen times. It hasn't worked for them. And we haven't landed on what works for them. But this is the case management. So, as a developer, as I'm building residential rental units, I'm thinking about managing the property, but I'm not thinking about managing the people in that property. And if that housing model is going to work, if we're going to be successfully housing somebody that's in a chronic homeless situation because of these behavioral mental health issues, there has to be a management of the population. It's this case management. It's the wraparound services concept. And I think that if we're more successful with that, the impact on the surrounding communities will be less also. So I'll just leave. We could talk more about that, but I'll.
Well, I see the mayor nodding her head.
I just want to underscore for Utahns how mind-blowingly huge that number is. For the state of Utah to be considering $128 million in the governor's budget for deeply affordable housing is above and beyond any number that we've seen go to the state legislature from a governor for 40% and below dedicated. And there's more for above 40% affordable housing. So this is a seismic shift. And I give credit to Wayne Niederhauser for jumping in head first to find out what is going on in the systems of homeless services and housing in the state of Utah, and really what do we need to do. But I want to say, if we're able to achieve that kind of deeply affordable housing creation and stimulate that in the state, Wayne is right. A good piece of it needs to be permanent supportive, and that means ongoing operational dollars. And right now, our service providers who are running our homeless resource centers in Salt Lake County are running them at a deficit year over year. They do not have enough money for operating. And these permanent supportive, as Jean said, are the most expensive types of housing. But it's kind of like, it's difficult to say, like, don't get distracted by the fact that that's the most expensive type of housing, because we are not appropriately or even close to calculating the on-street and community-wide impacts, the expenses of not housing these individuals, the expenses on their individual lives. So that is a tremendous expense that I would always wager is much greater than the actual cost of permanent supportive housing. But it's going to mean more money in the future to keep that housing supported and going.
Wayne Niederhauser, you're good at counting votes. So have you started counting votes and what do you think the prospects are for this money? The mayor said it's a seismic shift. Are you hopeful?
I'm extremely hopeful, and very confident. But maybe I shouldn't say that.
Maybe you shouldn't.
Don't count your chickens.
No, I think that this is real. I think that we are going to have some success with this. So
I want to ask, the the question that often comes up is whether or not, what other kinds of coalitions are out there? Does this have to be, clearly you're talking about the possibilities for government getting involved and the necessity. Jean Hill, you talked about that, the rest of you. What about private institutions? What about churches? What about rather large churches in this particular place, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints? What role do they play in all of this? Jean Hill, I'll throw it to you. Go ahead.
As the religion representative.
Yes.
I will say the LDS Church is playing a huge role. They give a lot of resources to all of our service providers to do the work that they do. Private business gives a lot of resources to do the work that's being done. I think what's difficult for service providers is that their funding for services is always through competitive processes. So it's not guaranteed from year to year, and that makes things a little bit more difficult. But those religions and private philanthropists and private businesses are contributing a lot of volunteers and a lot of dollars to help make all of this happen. Because I do not expect government to fund everything that's done in homeless services, because they could never do it all themselves either. It's got to be a partnership, public and private partnership. And it is at this point in the time in the state, which is great. I think, our struggle has been getting that buy-in from the state legislature to fund these kinds of services. And that is definitely improving. And again, if this money goes through, that will be huge. And then if we can do something to ensure services, and that can be through that same kind of combination of public and private resources that makes sure that the services can happen. And I will tell you, I have to put a pitch out there right now, 2 pitches actually. First, we have to look at housing as healthcare, because we know housing is healthcare. So there's money to tap into, especially, there are Medicaid dollars that can be tapped into for this. So we have other options as well. And then secondly, I'm going to throw, this is totally not even a segue to anything, Doug, and I apologize, but right now what our service providers need most are employees. We have got to find people to help staff our overflow shelters. So people out there who want to help, if you need a part-time job, if you know someone who needs a part-time job, all of our providers are advertising on their websites. Go to them, help them. We cannot open overflow until we have staff.
Nothing wrong with that. Go for it. Sydney, I wonder, is this working? I'm just wondering about some of the creative models, ideas that you're seeing in other places. Is this working anywhere as far as you can tell? Are there models out there that are good guides?
I mean, the strongest pieces of evidence we have point to housing first. The longitudinal studies that have been done up in Canada have over the last decade just repeatedly point to the idea that it's a successful model. On the other hand, housing first doesn't work if there's no housing. So that's that continues to be an issue. And oftentimes what we see here in Seattle is we kind of dance our way around that fundamental issue or the root causes of homelessness by doing all these little pilot programs and, where 60 people are enrolled. And isn't this a potential solution? But, none of it's really scaled up, and rarely does it address root causes. So yeah, I can't point a finger to anywhere and say, look, they're doing it right. I think, anywhere in the United States, any urban area is facing these issues. And I think it's going to be an increasing problem in the future. It's only a matter of time until, I think East Coast cities begin to grapple with the scale of unsheltered homelessness that we're seeing out here in the West. Even though, some cities like New York have massive shelter systems, they've just approached the problem of homelessness really differently. They haven't really solved it either. Even though there's less visible homelessness on the streets of New York, that doesn't mean that there's less homelessness. It's just all inside a shelter system. So I think we have tremendous evidence supporting the idea that people need to be housed in order to get stable, in order to address some of those other issues Wayne and Jean and Mayor Mendenhall brought up about mental illness and substance use disorder. It's just we haven't done it.
One of the issues from the Pioneer Park Coalition was how it is we define success. Tyler Clancy told us this week that right now we have these metrics like the number of blankets and the number of meals offered. But he says we should define success as something more permanent and meaningful. Like, were we able to, through these services, get someone a job? Did we offer them mental health services? Did we help them deal with addiction issues? He says put more focus on the inputs or the outputs than the inputs. I'm wondering, does anyone want to say anything about that question? Like how it is we're defining whether or not we're succeeding?
I'll chime in because this city, Salt Lake City, started a pilot program in October of last year that became permanent with our budget cycle of June of this year, called the Community Commitment Program, where Salt Lake City and over a dozen service provider agencies, including our own justice court system, the health department, driver's license division, detox services, VOA, veterans, all sorts of different service providers go out to where people are at in these large encampments and spend a couple of weeks trying to engage and get to know who these individuals are, if they're willing to talk, try to build some rapport and really understand what their specific needs and also what kind of resources they may have access to, whether they're a veteran or there's Medicaid dollars that are available, et cetera. And then ultimately make an offer of those services and hopefully shelter or bed or other housing opportunities, detox bed somewhere. And tragically, I think a majority of people who are engaged and offered something end up saying no and declining that offer. But regardless, being able to bring the services to the individuals is happening. Those offers of direct opportunity that are specific to the individual are happening through the Community Commitment Program. I think what we hear the Pioneer Park Coalition say is we want to withhold funding unless you can show that you're meeting those outcomes of offering or actually connecting people, which is obviously their choice to say yes or no. But the tracking of that isn't something that the state has equipped, and I don't believe that it should fall onto each and every individual city to make up their own ways of tracking that. That should be something that is consistent if there is going to be those kind of ties placed on the support. And again, Salt Lake City doesn't get any support from the state of Utah, at least nothing guaranteed. We're in to fight for the very few dollars that there are with most other cities. So it's I think it's an easy thing to say, but it's a more difficult thing to implement. And I haven't heard the state talk about doing it.
Wayne Niederhauser, why?
Well, that's good. That's a good question. When I think that's why the Office of Homeless Services was created. So before, homeless services is buried deep in workforce services, and you just didn't get the attention. And now that this office has been created, it's still within workforce services, but it's very visible. And the statute enables me, tells me that this office, my position, has a responsibility to reach out now to Health and Human Services, to corrections, to the judicial system, and coordinate more what's happening. And it creates a more visibility with the legislature regarding policy, to have this focus on this very difficult problem. Doug, I've seen a lot of issues as a legislator, and I didn't appreciate a lot of those. And one of those was homelessness. But now, having been involved and actually, talking with people, trying to understand their situation, I think it's one of the most difficult issues to solve, so to speak. I don't know if that's, we can even talk in terms of solving, but because of some of those core issues, mental health and behavioral health, it makes it extremely difficult. And yes, housing is key to that. or is a key to that. But someone said housing first, but we got to have the housing. Well, housing doesn't work either without the management of the behavioral and mental health issues. And so that's a very important part of successful housing.
Let me go to a few questions from some of the people who've joined us. From Leslie. Leslie says, what small changes can you do as a community to help the homeless? Is it starting small by donating to local homeless food banks, clothing, blankets, food? Jean Hill, I'll put that to you. What are the small changes that you're thinking about?
All of those things are always needed. And I urge people to go to the providers' websites to see what they really need. Because, you'll see sometimes people get a great idea of, thousands of teddy bears. Well, for the most part, socks are much more needed. So check and see what they need when you make your donations. But yes, those donations are definitely appreciated. And I do think we need people to be advocates. Again, the homeless don't get to be their voice for themselves all the time, because they've got bigger issues to worry about than advocating. So they need us to be advocates with them. And that means talking to not only legislators, but also cities. And if you're in a city without a homeless shelter, or you're in a city without services, then what is your city doing? Do they have laws that are discouraging people from coming into the city? Or do they have laws that are discouraging housing? Let's get the county-wide experience for someone who's experiencing homelessness to be a consistent experience of dignity, rather than, oh, I got off tracks and immediately got stopped by a police officer because I looked homeless and I got off tracks in the wrong city. So that's a little step up from just donating, but that's, a big need, and advocating for this money for housing is going to be huge. And then again, I'll make that push again. Go and work for a homeless service provider, because they desperately need you.
Kara wants to know, why can't we have an open space in the city limits like the fairgrounds where people can camp safely outside, complete with bathrooms and showers and services nearby? Mayor, you want to take that one? Why can't we just do it that way?
I don't know what single dollar, what resources for management, what responsibility the city would or should bring to a conversation like that. We have seen, as we've talked a couple times now, about the lack of financial support for Salt Lake City to do the $15 million a year we already do out of our taxpayer pockets to try to support and manage homelessness in the city. We need conversations at Salt Lake County or at the state if there's going to be conversations about a sanctioned encampment, because that is not something that we have seen other cities. And Sydney City is a place that has taken on sanctioned camping in certain areas over time. We've seen, and Wayne has visited Austin, who fairly recently sanctioned an encampment area and actually didn't see a decrease in on-street camping whatsoever. They saw people come into the sanctioned camp area, but didn't see a decrease on street. So we need to actually, I think, ask the question about whether or not that is a solution that solves for what we're trying to solve for here, or if it ends up attracting more people, perhaps from even outside of the state, to come and take that space. But the city, Salt Lake City, and I think any other city in the state, doesn't have the capacity or the resources to do it decently. And I'll just say quickly, I think about what happened last winter when one of our residents in the city thought that they would turn their yard into a sanctioned encampment space. And we had a woman die in her tent. It's not an easy thing to manage. And the city has no resources to do that.
Well, there are a lot of questions and a lot of issues we didn't get to. I'm hoping we've jump-started a conversation that we can continue. Let me ask you finally, though, it was one of those questions that we were thinking about when we were promoting this evening, and that is the idea of, can you solve homelessness? Or is that absurd? Is this just something that we always, because of the nature of, I think, Mary, you put it this way, humanity, the human condition, it's something we're always going to be contending with. So let me give you all a chance to get at that. Sydney Brownstone, why don't you go first? Can you solve homelessness? You've been working on this for a few years now. What do you think to that question?
I think there are definitely things we can do to mitigate the crisis. You know, the results of a backlog of affordable housing are kind of coming to bear on us right now. So, and I think, you know, humans are complicated. Homelessness is complicated, but at the same time, it's not as complicated as we make it seem. The challenge is actually putting the money in policies to do it. And I think the tricky part is that if we were all honest with ourselves about the scale of the problem and what needed to be done, we would recognize that it's not, you know, $129 million here and there, even not to shade $129 million. That sounds like a very significant investment. But we instead, we have this ongoing debate about short-term solutions versus long-term solutions, and you have multiple different actors, state, local, federal government, and you have nonprofits. So it's a very disorganized, fragmented system. But on a personal note, I have to believe that it can be solved because, there's just so much more, there's so much room for improvement. And I haven't seen policymakers make the changes that researchers have been saying are necessary for decades now.
Wayne Rouser, you've been doing this now since April. Do you seeing some clarity that would lead you to think there is some kind of solution down the line?
I think, Doug, you mentioned, can we solve homelessness? Well, let me just say that, yes, I believe we can provide the housing. It's going to take a big effort, a big budget effort. Government has to be involved in that. I believe that could happen and can happen. Okay. But based on current understanding, can we solve mental health issues, mental illness? I think we can make the situation better, but I wouldn't talk in terms of solving that. I would talk in terms of, better understanding it, putting more money into research, and with behavioral health too. We're not having a ton of success with that. We've been fighting drugs and addiction for how many decades? And we're not having a lot of success with that. But I can tell you that I have hope for those issues. But I don't see the solution to those issues today.
Jean Hill, what do you think?
I think we can solve it in the sense of reaching functional zero. I think if we reach a point where the barriers to homelessness are greater than the barriers out of homelessness, we can reach a point where people will fall into homelessness, but hopefully we're able to get them out quickly and they don't ever fall back into it again.
Mayor, I'll give you the final word.
I think I said toward the beginning that I have more hope in our opportunity to better address homelessness than I've ever had as a Salt Laker. And it's because of the tenacious curiosity of these people and dozens of people who we work with that are approaching zoning. We're approaching partnership with private development. We're looking at these root causes finally with, I think, a more sincere curiosity than we've seen in government. And I agree with Jean that I think it's possible to reach a functional zero whereby not everyone will be housed. There will always be people who choose to be out of housing. But what I think is possible is that we could actually have some suite of opportunities that they could consider if they decided to. And that is not, as we've talked about, one single type of housing or one single type of services. It's unique to the individuals. And that's what's developing right now in these conversations, with these funding conversations, and with the partnerships that we're seeing in the state of Utah, I think stronger than ever.
Erin Mendenhall, Mayor of Salt Lake City. Mayor, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Jean Hill, she's the government liaison and director of the Office of Life, Justice, and Peace for the Catholic Diocese of Salt Lake City. Jean Hill, thank you.
Thank you.
Cindy Brownstone, reporter for the Seattle Times, member of the Project Homeless Reporting Project. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
And Wayne Niederhauser, former Senate President serving as Utah's State Homeless Services Coordinator. Wayne Niederhauser, thank you very much to you as well.
Thanks, Doug.
We should thank the mayor's staff as well: Lindsay Nicola, Andrew Johnston, Gabby Romney, Kim Thomas, Brian Young. The library staff that helped us this week: Nate Salazar, Aleco Campos, Elizabeth King. Radio West is a production of KUER. Station managers Christy Miners. The program produced by Carrie Watson, Benjamin Bombard, and Tim Slover. I'm Doug Fabrizio. Thanks very much, everyone, and good night.